Wrestling has a deep history of characters with multiple personalities, with the likes of Mick Foley showing this in his three faces. But what about those performers who have a dark side alter ego? The ones who have let their scary side out from time to time? Well, that's exactly who we're going to be looking at right now, starting with one of the best examples of this in the modern day, Bo Dallas and his own alter ego, Uncle Howdy. Yes, prior to 2024, WWE fans knew Bo Dallas for being the former NXT World Champion who was only too happy to believe in himself to an absolutely delusional degree. And if there was anything else the fans knew the Brooksville native for, it was the fact he was the brother of Bray Wyatt. So when Bray made his return to WWE in 2022 with an all-new character, one who was being haunted by a mysterious figure known as Uncle Howdy, it made all the sense in the world for Dallas to portray the figure. Sadly though, as we all know now, before that story could reach its climax, Bray would tragically pass away in August of 2023. But this wasn't the end of Uncle Howdy. No, in tribute to his late brother, Bo Dallas would bring that character back again in 2024, with the idea now being that it was clear for everyone to see it was indeed him under the mask, but that he was continuing on the gimmick so that Bray's name would never be forgotten. And that's exactly why the stable which surrounds Uncle Howdy today, the one made up of Eric Rowan, Dexter Lumis, Joe Gacy, and Nikki Cross, are known as the Wyatt Six. Does this mean we can expect to see a lot more of Bo letting us into his darker side as the years go on? Absolutely, because given how successful this one has been with audiences, we don't imagine it'll be going away anytime soon. No, it looks like Uncle Howdy is here to stay after all. And that's going to mean bad news for the Raw roster if what they've already done to the likes of Chad Gable and the Creed brothers is anything to go by. Sure, we'll probably still see Dallas the Man from time to time too, but for the most part now, he's fully embraced the character his brother created. And this will no doubt only see him go on to greater success, just the same way our next subject saw greater success when they transformed from Kevin Kelly into Nailz. No, we're not talking about that Kevin Kelly here, the commentator for companies like WWE, AEW, and New Japan. Rather, we're talking about the former star of Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association. But while his early incarnation as Mr. Magnificent might have seen Kelly be presented as a heel there, it wasn't what you'd call a dark one. Rather, it was that of a cocky jock who knew he was better than everything else. So why does the Minnesotan earn a spot on today's video then? Well, because once he joined WWF full-time in 1992 after having made a couple of cameo appearances there in the years prior, he'd be repackaged into an all-new gimmick of Nailz. And this character was far more evil in its nature than anything he'd done before. After all, the whole idea was that he was a convict who had escaped from prison specifically so he could go after the man who put him there in the first place, the Big Boss Man. Was this all a bit cartoonish? Yes, but it was the golden era of WWF, where everything was a cartoon. And enough was added to the whole presentation here so as to make it genuinely creepy for many kids watching at the time. Yes, the fact is that for fans of a certain age, this is a dark gimmick which will always remain in memory, if for no other reason than because of those weird promos where voice modulation was used to make Kelly's speech about 2 octaves lower than it would have been normally. But let's move away from the golden era for now and onto that famous Attitude Era properly, as it's there we find our next subject, the man who started out as Mabel and who later became Viscera. That's right, cast your minds back if you will to 1995, a strong contender for the worst year in WWE's history. That was the year Mabel would infamously win the King of the Ring and be violently rejected by a hardcore Philly crowd in the process. But this wasn't all he was doing then, of course. No, after winning the King of the Ring, Mabel, the man who had entered WWF not long before as part of a Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff inspired tag team, went on to challenge Diesel for the WWF title at SummerSlam in an absolute stinker of a bout. Understandably then, this did not see the big man have many fans in management afterwards, so it was clear that if he wanted to continue on with the company, a change was going to be needed. And luckily for him, a change would come in early 1999, as it was then he would be abducted by The Undertaker, indoctrinated into his Ministry of Darkness, and from there, rechristened as Viscera. That's right, now dropping all the old aspects of his gimmick and embracing his new darker side, Viscera became a regular fixture of the Attitude Era, as there was always going to be space during this period for a big, imposing heel like he was. Hell, even after the Ministry disbanded later that year, Viscera would continue on with the character well into 2000. and once this run came to an end, he'd return a few years later with a slightly updated version of it, the still dark, though now romantically inclined, The World's Largest Love Machine. Sure, Big Daddy V, another variant of Viscera which came sometime after that, might have been a miss, mostly on account of the awful ring gear the character had, but that doesn't mean the sheer shelf life of Viscera makes it anything less than a huge upgrade from what Mabel was doing. And Mabel isn't the only new generation act who got better when they got dark upon joining the Ministry of Darkness, as the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Phineas Godwin, the man who would later become Mideon. Yes, you all remember Mideon, we're sure. After all, even in an era of weird gimmicks, he was among the weirdest, as this soothsayer for The Undertaker was certainly out there by late 90s television standards. What's easy to forget now, though, is that before he ever fell to the dark side, Dennis Knight already had a notable run in WWF during the mid-90s as Phineas Godwin, one half of the wrestling pig farmer duo, the Godwins. Not that you should forget this one, though, as the team actually had a fair bit of success together, with them even becoming two-time tag team champions. That said, it was once he started embracing his more evil side that Knight unlocked arguably his most memorable creation, with this being a creation that, like with Viscera, would also live on after the Ministry of Darkness came to an end. In fact, like with Viscera, it would also take on different incarnations over the years, with the most notable one probably being the infamous Naked Mideon, a character which was basically what would happen if the former Phineas Godwin became Party Boy from Jackass. And in perhaps an even bigger twist, in recent years, Mideon has left the ring behind entirely and started a whole new life as the food industry's darkest chef. Of course, most wrestling fans will remember him best for his time in the Squared Circle, however, as that's where he entertained them the most. And while there was entertainment to be found in both characters he played, it's arguably the darker side that was the most entertaining of all. In fact, even now, this many years on, it's still easy to recall Mideon as he stood out so much at the time. And given all the things that have happened in WWE since then, the fact he remains as notable as ever is quite an achievement, especially as he was never really booked above the level of mid-carder. But what about Attitude Era characters who got dark without needing to join The Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness? There has to be examples of them too, right? Well, yes there is, and one of the most prominent of these is our next subject, a man better known as Terry Funk, but who, for a time being in the late 90s, instead went by the moniker of Chainsaw Charlie. Yes, you could argue here that Terry Funk was already dark enough because, while his early decades as a wrestler during the Territory era had been characterized by him being a technical wizard and former NWA World's Champion, his later run saw him fully embrace the violence and blood when he reinvented himself as the godfather of hardcore wrestling. Need any evidence of just how dark Funk could get during this time? Just look at the work he did as a sadistic heel during the 80s, where he often tried to scar his opponents with a branding iron, and if not that, then alternatively, you can look at what he was doing over in Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling during the mid-90s, as there, already a senior citizen by wrestling standards of the time, he was setting the bar for everyone around him with his brutal hardcore brawls. That said, for as violent as things could get for him over in Philly, we're still going to include Chainsaw Charlie as being the darker incarnation here because, come on now, it was a man wielding a chainsaw. Literally the actions of a horror movie villain. And while this man was Terry Funk with his face covered up by a pair of pantyhose, it only made it all the more terrifying as there was a real sense that someone was going to get hurt, whether that be someone in the ring or in the audience. Sure, Terry was always in full control of things, and in reality, we all knew it was him under the mask. But even if he was everyone's favorite wrestling grandpa by then, someone it was impossible to think of as truly evil, he was able to sell the whole character enough that it took on all the darkness which was inherent within it. And this saw the Texan manage to find a whole lot of success he'd never had in WWF prior, success such as winning the tag team titles with his old friend and foe, Cactus Jack. Yes, it was quite a final run in WWF for the Funkster, and it only added to his case for being one of the greatest legends the wrestling industry has ever seen. But it's not always later in their career that someone gets fully taken over by the darkness. No, sometimes the dark alter ego comes before the more lighthearted one. And this can perhaps be seen most clearly in the case of our next subject, The Godfather, and his earlier version, Papa Shango. That's right, before he was ever wrestling's preeminent pimp, Charles Wright was working for the WWF during the early 90s as the voodoo priest Papa Shango, someone who would regularly use the dark arts to perform magical curses on his opponents prior to bouts. Obviously then, this is a far cry from the guy who was bringing hoes down to the ring every week during the late 90s, and it's also a far cry from the real-life character of Wright, someone who himself was the owner of a gentleman's club in Las Vegas. But even if it was a total 180 from what he'd normally be, the Nevada-born star was able to make it work by fully buying into the whole thing, so much so that he'd even adorn himself in ring gear and face paint heavily inspired by the character of Baron Samedi in the James Bond film Live and Let Die. And with this fully scaring early 90s kids watching both on TV and live in person, then it got over like gangbusters. Yes, with this character he was able to get a nice run for himself, feuding with the likes of the Ultimate Warrior and Bret Hart. Sure, the thing he's most memorable for now might be the time he missed his cue to do a run-in during the main event of WrestleMania 8, but that shouldn't suggest the Voodoo Priest isn't worthy of a spot in today's video. No, he's a prime example of how a real-life, good-natured performer can really sell a darker alter ego when they want to, and how they don't have to have a single Lady of the Night in sight in order to do so. Of course, our next subject never had to have a Lady of the Night in sight during their regular run or their darker run either. And that's because when it comes to someone like Sting, it's less about the women and more about always getting in the head of his opponents, whether that be in his Crow incarnation or his Joker one. Now again, like with Terry Funk, you could argue that Crow Sting was already pretty dark. After all, in comparison to the original Surfer version Steve Borton had created back in the 80s, it felt like a eulogy for a time in wrestling which had come and gone. Hell, Crow Sting went so far as to exclusively dress in black and always wear monochromatic white face paint. And for the first 15 months of existence, he did nothing but sit up in the rafters, brooding and watching what was happening to his company as the NWO slowly took over. That said, while The Crow, the cult movie this character was based on, was certainly about as gothic as it got for the mid-90s, come the late 2000s, there was a whole new face of darkness in the world of film, and that face was Heath Ledger's iconic portrayal of the Joker in 2008's The Dark Knight. So it should really come as little surprise then that in the early 2000s when Sting, who was by now working for TNA, felt the need to shake things up a little bit and create something new for more modern audiences, he began taking on aspects of this version of Batman's greatest foe. And this meant less brooding and more cackling with laughter, as the now red-lipped Steve Borton fully embraced the evil which came with being the Clown Prince of Crime. Sure, he was technically a babyface for large parts of this run, but even as a babyface, he always remained dark in his nature. And the darkness which flooded out of Joker Stings at all times was apparent for everyone to see. All you had to do was look at the work he was putting out during his feuds with the likes of Hulk Hogan and Kurt Angle if you want any evidence of this. Hell, so much did it hit home with fans, Steve Borton would even keep elements of it years after the fact when he had his retirement run in AEW. And Sting isn't the only legendary wrestler who found an all-new side of himself while working in both the Impact Zone and Jacksonville. No, there are plenty of others who managed to do this too, with one of the biggest examples of this being our next subject, Jeff Hardy, and the time he became Willow. That's right, Jeff Hardy is a legend of both tag team and singles wrestling, multiple-time world champion, pioneer of the tables, ladders, and chairs match, and an icon of 90s alternative kids everywhere. And one of the main reasons the charismatic enigma has been able to have such longevity both in wrestling and in pop culture is because, ever the artistic soul, he's constantly been looking for a way to keep himself fresh. But while there have been various times he's done this over the years, perhaps none are better remembered than when, while working for TNA in the 2010s, Hardy brought back an old indie character of his, one named Willow, or Willow the Wisp if we want to give it the full moniker. Who was Willow? Well, he was an even more surreal and psychedelic version of the North Carolinian, one who always wore a strange mask and who took part in truly bizarre vignettes and promo segments usually designed to get in his opponent's head before the bell ever had a chance to ring. Needless to say then, this strategy worked out pretty well as over the course of the next year or so, Willow would find a fair amount of success going up against opponents like EC3, James Storm, and Magnus, the man currently known as SmackDown's general manager Nick Aldis. And even when Hardy reverted back to his original form in the summer of 2014 in order to reform the Hardy Boys with his brother Matt, it wouldn't be the last time we'd see Willow. No, in the years since, he's continued to make cameo appearances from time to time, more often than not as part of the Broken Hardy Universe's cinematic matches. Does this mean we can expect to see even more of Willow as time goes on from here? Possibly. The only question is, will it happen in TNA or in WWE? As with those two promotions currently engaged in a working relationship with one another, there's now some real crossover between them for the first time ever. And because of this crossover, it also means there's also the chance that a current day star like Wendy Choo could make her way over to the Impact Zone on a longer term basis, in the process taking her alternative character of Darkside Wendy with her more often. Yes, Wendy Choo is someone who took a little while to get going since joining WWE in 2018. After all, despite initially getting over in Ring of Honor as Karen Q, she'd immediately be rebranded as Mei Ying upon signing on the dotted line with the WWE. And this mystical gimmick didn't really go anywhere for the New York native, so it's just as well she'd be rebranded again sometime after this as Wendy Choo. And even though this gimmick went a lot better than her previous one, she still felt like she could be doing more, as with her new character of being a woman who constantly wanted to take a nap during her matches, it was unlikely to get her to the point of ever winning any gold. But even if the gimmick was more comedic in its nature, it didn't mean there wasn't a darker side for Choo to tap into, and this darker side had become very apparent in recent months. That's right, it was after taking a short hiatus and returning in the spring of 2024 that the former Karen Q returned with a much more sinister version of her character, with this being clear in the fact she now dressed in darker clothing and wore black eyeliner. It certainly worked, so much so that now, instead of being treated like a comedy character, Choo has been able to finally rise up the ranks somewhat by getting involved in feuds with Tatum Paxley and even acting as the representative of the NXT Women's Division in TNA when she traveled over there to challenge Knockouts World Champion Jordynne Grace at September 13th, 2024's Victory Road pay-per-view. So the only question left then is, where does this darker version of Wendy go from here? Does she continue to lean into the evil and use this to catapult herself up to the main roster? Probably at some point. And once this happens, she's inevitably going to find herself on the opposite end of the ring from people like Rhea Ripley, Io Sky, and Bayley. Or who knows? Maybe it won't work out for her in the long run, as having a dark character doesn't necessarily lead to success. And if you need any evidence of this statement being true, you need look no further than our next subject, Yoshi Tatsu, and the time he embraced his dark side. Yes, back in the late 2000s, after a successful early run in New Japan, Tatsu signed on the dotted line with WWE, and from there proceeded to become something of a staple of WWE CW and SmackDown's undercard over the next few years. Of course, as he was doing this, he was always presented as a babyface, someone who fought for all that was good and right in the world, but after eating one too many losses and then having an action figure of his broken by Tyson Kidd, a darker side of the Gifu native was unleashed, one which would affectionately become to be known by fans of his as Darkside Yoshi Tatsu. What did this new personality entail? Well, now rather than have a blonde streak in his hair, he had a red one. And on top of that, Tatsu also started painting half of his face. As you can guess then, this was an altogether moodier and more maudlin affair. Though we should mention the darkness of it was undercut a little by the fact that he still had his old bubbly J-pop theme music. But regardless of these factors going against it, Yoshi Tatsu was still able to present himself as something new during this run, something which had a lot more of a dark edge to it. And while it might not have been as successful as other dark side transformations, it was still a pretty good effort for someone working in the PG environment at the time. But then all the examples we've looked at today were pretty good efforts, as they all showed that sometimes it's important to go over to the dark side if you want to prove you can be more.